The Beatles are a classic rock band from Liverpool, England. Their whole thing is that they pioneered the rock genre, but you already knew that. I'm here to talk about what they did before they did that. The Beatles were started in 1960 by John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Pete Best, Stuart Sutcliffe, Chas Newby, Norman Chapman, and Tommy Moore. Now, I know you're probably wondering, who are these people, and why isn't Ringo on there? But you have to bear with me, because I am about to explain that. Speaking of Ringo, Sir Richard Starkey was born July 7th, 1940. While his mother, Elise, was pretty nice, his father of the same name as him rarely returned. Because he had no siblings and no father, Richard was pretty lonely. But then at the age of 6, he stopped being so lonely. He was brought to a place where there were a lot of people who wore white robes. This place was called the hospital. The only downside to being in this hospital was that there was a lot of pain. Still, while there, the people in the white robes took out his appendix, and after the surgery, he was all clear to wake up. Until he didn't. He spent a whole year in a coma. So yeah, that must have been fun. After Richard finally returned home, it was time for him to go back to school. Problem was, after losing a whole year of progress, he was pretty dang bad at it. But good news, he didn't have to go to school. He went to the hospital again. This time he was there for 2 years due to catching a cold. Yes, a cold. Now, there's one good thing about this. While in that hospital, there was a traveling band that went from hospital bed, playing songs to cheer the other kids up. The drummer of the band gave Richard an opportunity to play on the drums himself. He loved it. When he finally got home, he used some empty cookie tins to make his own drum kit. When he had nothing else to do, he'd play on the drums. And there came a time when he had nothing else to do, and that time was when he dropped out of school at age 15. The dropout would have to find a job because, unfortunately, playing drums off the side of the street isn't enough to make a living. His job became adjusting water pipes so that they could work again. Yeah, great job for a drummer, I know. By the way, I should mention, he was a minor during all of this. When he stopped being a minor, his mom bought him a set of real drums, and this may or may not have influenced the entire rest of his career. After getting the best gift of his life, Richard formed a band called the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group. They played during breaks at his job. It didn't matter that he had to work 2 jobs, because the band wasn't a job. The band was Richard's passion. Next to be born is John Lennon, the main Beatle, the biggest Beatle. When John Lennon was born, the city of Liverpool was being bombed during World War II. Right as he arrived, the entire hospital shook from the sound of the bombs. Great environment to be born, I know. Now, Liverpool as a whole wasn't that great, even before John was born. The town was wet and run down, and almost none of the buildings were still up. Relating back to Ringo's situations, John Dad was almost never around. Unfortunately, his mother didn't have enough money to fund the baby boy, and his father eventually stopped supporting the family. Soon, the father offered to take the baby boy, but said baby boy wouldn't be leaving his mother, until he did. John's father tried to take the boy to New Zealand. No, that's not a joke. And Miss Lennon found out at the very last second what was going on. She realized she wouldn't be able to take care of the boy anymore, so instead of sending him to her spouse, Miss Lennon sent John to Miami. Wait, no, not Miami. Mimi. Mimi was John's aunt. Surprisingly, despite this entire situation would tell you, John Lennon was pretty happy. Mimi gave John lots of books, and he liked to draw monsters. If he was a little older, John probably would have realized that it's pretty weird to live with your aunt and have your mother visit you from time to time. Plus, said mother acted more like a buddy than a biological parent. But that buddy did help out, because she introduced John to the banjo. It's not exactly the guitar, but still. Well, until it was exactly the guitar. That same mother gave John his very own guitar. Unfortunately, however, the situation wasn't exactly perfect, and Mimi was pretty mean, and John acted up a lot. The worst part is that he was a pretty smart person, but he used his brain for nothing. You see, Mom, I'm going to become John Lennon when I grow up. The only good part about John's behavior was the fact that he wrote little poems in his quote-unquote notebook. A guitar and poems. I wonder what that'll become. Just kidding, I don't wonder, because I already know what happens to him. Now, unfortunately, a few months before John Lennon left school forever, his mother got hit by a car. This hurt him so much that he later went on to use the guitar and his poetry to write a song called Julia in her memory. John's only coping mechanism was to act up in class and listen to rock and roll music. Hey, those are my coping mechanisms too. See, I told you I'm going to become John Lennon. John's favorite rock and roll artist was Elvis Presley. Yeah, that guy was pretty cool. Cool enough to influence music as a whole for the rest of time. That's tricky. John liked dressing up as Elvis and playing some of his songs. Maybe it didn't take him to get practice with his guitar, though, so he had to learn it all by himself. Maybe insisted that John would never make a living off of a simple guitar. Next up to be born is Paul McCartney. Paul was a kid, just like all humans. However, he wasn't like all humans because he was quite, large. His brother Michael was a jerk about this to him. Try to ignore it as he might, it didn't work. So Paul started losing weight. This, however, wasn't that important. What is important is that his mother had a private hospital room because she was a nurse. Actually, no, that's not very important either. Anyway, Paul. He was a pretty good kid. He excelled at Latin. He had good friends. He knew good people. He was a pretty good person. Paul, just like John, liked Elvis Presley. He also liked another pianist, Little Richard. No, not that Richard, the one we talked about 2 segments ago. Little Richard was a pianist who did a lot of screaming. Paul liked that, and so he started imitating the screaming. This inspired the song Twist and Shout. Now, unlike the 2 previously mentioned Beatles, Paul actually had a caring father. This father led a band called Jim Mack's Jazz Band. He would play songs for Paul to listen to, which inspired the boy to get into more music. The youngest of the Beatles is George Harrison. He actually had a pretty decent childhood. George wasn't very interested in music as a child. He wasn't interested in a lot of things, except for dressing in weird ways. He grew his hair long and wore tight jeans to school, and he got made fun of for it. He pretended the reason that his hair was so long is because his father was his hair cutter when the scissors he used hurt, but the real reason is because he just thought he looked cool in long hair. It took until age 14 for George to show any sort of interest in music when he heard the British singer by the name of Lonnie Donegan, I don't know, play skiffle music. Skiffle music is rock and roll, but faster. George wanted to learn to do that, and so he got his own guitar for $5. George played that guitar so much his fingertips would literally bleed during sessions, but that didn't matter. George wanted to be great. George, however, wanted a louder guitar. He wanted a guitar people could hear from far away. He wanted a guitar with a little more oomph, right? So his mom got him an electric guitar. George and his older brother Peter formed a band called the Rebels because of how good he was on guitar. One day, after performing, George Harrison was on a bus with this guy named Paul McCartney. They became friends and got a little bit of practice together. George didn't actually like singing, but it's a good thing Paul did. And so, they teamed up. Now, back in the day, before the Beatles' time, there was a genre of music called rhythm and blues. This music influenced what the Beatles would call rock and roll. The problem with this music was that the only way to listen to it would be through the radio. The problem with that is the fact that it peaked around the 1950s, and segregation was still a thing during those times. And rhythm and blues was created by and for black people. DJs on the radio would refuse to play music made by black people, meaning the Beatles never got to hear what influenced their rock and roll, which accidentally caused pioneering in rock and roll music. However, the main reason I bring this up is because in America, white singers would also sing the songs of the black people. So when music companies asked white singers to do this, that was the birth of rock and roll. John Lennon had a band called the Quarrymen. Said Quarrymen were given their first opportunity to perform in John's local church. And guess who else was there at that church? Paul hecking McCartney. Paul was really impressed by John's performance and proved to John that he could play guitar too by grabbing some random person's guitar and using that to play. Luckily, John had noticed his mini performance and wanted to ask Paul to join the band. The problem is that he worried Paul would become more popular than him, but he ultimately decided that's worth the risk. The first show together was in October. After the show, Paul showed John the song he wrote about his mother's death. John then went home and made it into his own song called Hello, Little Girl. Now later on in the winter, Paul took John to meet his friend, George. John thought he'd be too young to play in a band, but Paul kind of forced him in. Now their band had 3 guitarists and no one else, so they went to look for drummers. They found a drummer named Colin, but he quit after a fight. They found Tommy Moore, but his girlfriend said he needed a paying job. Finally, they settled on Pete Best. They also figured they could probably use a bassist, so in came Stuart Sutcliffe. The only thing Stu did for the band was recommend they change their name from the Quarrymen into the Beatles. Not because of the bug, but because of the strong beat. And then he left. The bassist left. And then he called the band the Beatles, even though the bassist made... Back during this day, the Beatles didn't know they'd be the Fab Four, filling up baseball stadiums of people listening to their music. They knew they'd be the Fab Five. There were 5 members. But really, they were just 5 scruffy-looking teens trying their best to play music. And while it was their best, Stu was really bad. He only wanted to join because John said they needed a bassist, even though he'd literally never played the bass before in his life. He really wanted to be a painter. But screw that notion! What mattered was that John had only practiced guitar by himself, outside, so he wasn't the best at it. George and Paul weren't amazing either, and the only reason Pete was a drummer because he owned a drum set and partially knew how to use it. So yeah, a group of scrawny-looking teenagers playing music together, trying their best, with their best kinda sucking. What a great way to start the Beatles! But great news! The Beatles had their first real job! A club over in Hamburg, Germany needed a group of young, cheap rock and rollers for their club. Now, sure, the club was across the sea in a different country, and sure, they never had a real job before, but they got a paycheck, a place to sleep, even their own designated dressing room. They were excited as all heck. Their parents weren't, however. Aunt Mimi wanted John to stay in art school. Paul's dad didn't want him in Germany either. Now, the problem was that John and Paul were fully grown adults who can kind of just do whatever they wanted because they're adults. Now, the real problem was that the club, I can't put this any other way. The club sucked ass. It was dirty, it was smelly, it was full of lies. The dressing room was a public bathroom. Their beds were behind a local movie theater. They could never actually sleep. Instead, they were woken up by the sounds of the movies playing. Even when they were performing, they had to perform for 8 hours. Their audience was a group of jerks, but for some reason the Beatles didn't even mind the audience. But you know the craziest part? They couldn't eat food on their own time because they were too stressed out, and so they had to eat on stage. And these are the Beatles we're talking about. What the heck? How did they become the Beatles living like this? Now, despite all this, the Beatles somehow enjoyed their time here. Well, not in the club, but in Germany as a whole. Germany is actually the place where the iconic hairstyle of quote-unquote combing it forward was founded. And yet, they did have to leave eventually. Except for Stu. He wanted to stay in Germany. So, he was left behind. And then there were 4. John, Paul, George, and Pete. When they came home, they did some better performances, and the businessman Brian Epstein's attention was called with the boys. Brian made some changes. No more eating on stage, no more leather jackets. Instead, they'd wear matching suits to appeal to parents more. Surprisingly, these changes worked. The Beatles wanted one more thing. They wanted Ringo Starr. Pete has been failing them as a drummer, so they needed someone better. However, John didn't want to tell this to his friend directly, so he made Brian lay off Pete. So finally, in 1963, the 4 members of the Beatles went into the mainstream. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Thanks for watching. I had a voice clip of the thanks, but then it got corrupted, so I have just improvised things now. Thank you for watching. I made this video for my mom's birthday, so that's why there's a couple references to my mom in the video. I really don't know what to say, because I lost I lost the old video clip of the ending segment, so, goodbye, thank you for watching.